welcome to Haunted Midnight. I upload true stories every week on my channel, so if you enjoy this video, check out my other videos. Before we begin, over 90% of you are not subscribed. It would be amazing if you guys can subscribe and support me, as I am still a small channel. Thank you for watching. I was never one to believe in fairy tales, but I always hoped that one day Tinder might lead to something unexpected, something worth remembering. I had been swiping aimlessly for months until I matched with a guy whose profile was dripping with luxury. His pictures were sleek: designer suits, exotic vacations, expensive cars, and upscale dinners. I remember thinking how it was like stepping into a world I'd only ever dreamed about. Little did I know that behind that glimmering facade was a story that would haunt me long after our paths crossed. I agreed to meet him for coffee at a trendy little cafe downtown. The first time I saw him, he carried himself with an air of confidence, dressed impeccably in a crisp white shirt and perfectly tailored jeans. His eyes had a spark that made me believe he was everything his photos promised. Over the course of that afternoon, he recounted stories of business deals and trips abroad. I listened, dazzled by the tales of opulence and success. But even as I got lost in his narrative, a small part of my mind whispered doubts that I chose to ignore. After a few dates, he invited me to his apartment, claiming it was a recent upgrade from his previous place. I was impressed by the modern decor and the tasteful art on the walls, which he boasted about as if each piece had a story of its own. I couldn't help but notice that even though everything was immaculate, there was an unsettling vibe, a hidden emptiness that lurked behind the gleaming surfaces. I shrugged it off as nerves and excitement for being with someone who seemed so out of reach. As the weeks passed, I became more entangled in his world. Every time we met, he'd show me something new: an exclusive club, a high-end restaurant, or a private view at a gallery. I was swept away by the fantasy he presented, feeling as though I was living a life of luxury that was once reserved for only the chosen few. Yet, there was always a nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right. I began noticing inconsistencies in his stories, subtle hints that his background wasn't as glamorous as he portrayed. When he mentioned investments, the details were always vague. When he talked about trips abroad, the places didn't quite match up with his supposed status. The turning point came one evening when I received an unexpected text from an unknown number. It was a photograph of a modest, run-down building that looked nothing like the luxurious property he had claimed was his new apartment. The message was brief and anonymous, implying that what I had been led to believe was a grand lifestyle was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. My heart pounded as I stared at the image, each detail confirming that the world he had built for me was based on deception. I confronted him about it during our next date, but he brushed it off with a half-hearted laugh, claiming it was just a misunderstanding. Yet deep down, I knew that his words were hollow. The more I dug, the more I discovered. I began asking around subtly, piecing together bits of information from mutual acquaintances and even a few online forums. It became evident that he had a pattern of luring people into his fabricated world with promises of wealth and success. In reality, he was a fraud who had managed to keep up the charade by borrowing money, using fake documents, and even renting luxurious apartments to maintain his image. Every time someone started asking too many questions, he would disappear for days on end, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and empty dreams. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare where every detail was meticulously planned to ensnare the unsuspecting. The sense of betrayal hit me hard. Not only had I invested emotionally in someone I believed was extraordinary, but I had also become part of a scheme that preyed on people's deepest desires for a better life. I started receiving messages from other victims, sharing their similar experiences and warning me about the dangers of getting involved with someone whose lifestyle was too good to be true. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming as I realized that I was not alone in my predicament. It was as if he had been playing with multiple hearts, leaving chaos in his wake. Every time I looked back on the memories, I could see the cracks that I had ignored. The moments when his eyes flickered with something unspoken, the subtle shifts in his tone when he mentioned money, and the inexplicable anxiety that seemed to plague him during quiet moments. I was left wondering how someone could weave such an elaborate web of lies and maintain it for so long. The realization that I had been a part of his performance made me question everything I thought I knew about trust and romance. In the weeks following our final meeting, I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and profound sadness. I spent countless nights replaying every moment in my head, trying to understand how I had been so thoroughly deceived. I couldn't shake the image of his dazzling smile, now tainted by the knowledge of his fraud. The experience left me with a bitter taste and a deep sense of disillusionment about the promises of modern dating apps. I began to realize that behind every carefully curated profile could lurk a hidden truth waiting to shatter your illusions. Looking back now, I can see that the allure of wealth and luxury blinded me to the red flags that were right in front of me. I had been so captivated by the fantasy he presented that I failed to see the cracks in his armor until it was too late. The story I now carried is a reminder of the fragility of trust in a digital world where appearances can be manipulated and every image can be a lie. I have learned, through harsh experience, that sometimes the most alluring paths lead to the darkest destinations. I still wonder how many others have been drawn into his intricate scheme, and the thought makes me shudder. I continue to be cautious with new connections, always questioning the story behind the photos and words on the screen. Even though the experience has left a mark on me, I don't regret it entirely. It was a stark lesson in human vulnerability, and the lengths some will go to create a false sense of security and admiration. There is no grand moral to this tale, no uplifting conclusion to be found in the ruins of what was once a promising connection. The truth is as straightforward as it gets. He pretended to be rich, but in reality, he was a fraud who left a trail of shattered trust in his wake. That evening, as I closed the chapter on what had once seemed like a dream come true, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The facade was gone, and I was now facing the raw, unfiltered reality of a man who had deceived not just me but many others. I have no desire to revisit those memories, yet they remain etched in my mind, a constant reminder of the danger that lies in believing too readily in a perfect online persona. And so, with no further embellishments or lessons to be drawn, I end this account as a blunt recounting of a disturbing chapter in my life, one that serves as a cautionary tale in its own unvarnished way. I still remember the excitement and nervousness I felt when I first swiped right on his profile. I had been using Tinder off and on for a while, mostly just for fun, until I matched with someone who seemed too good to be true. His profile pictures were immaculate. A smiling man in trendy clothes, a backdrop of what appeared to be a cozy apartment, and captions that hinted at a successful life in the States. I was instantly intrigued and figured that this might be the beginning of something special. I didn't know then that I was about to dive into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. At first, our conversation flowed effortlessly. We exchanged stories about our interests, our work, and even our favorite hangout spots in the city. He always came across as genuine and caring, asking thoughtful questions and sharing personal details. What caught my attention the most was how he painted an image of himself as someone who had achieved a great deal in life. He often mentioned his job in finance and how he was working on big projects, which made me believe he was really established in the States. It felt like I was slowly being pulled into a glamorous world that I had only seen in movies. As the weeks went by, we started chatting more frequently. He was consistent and always seemed to have a reason to talk, whether it was to share a funny meme or to update me on his day. I began to let my guard down, enjoying the attention and feeling like I was building a connection with someone who truly cared. We started talking about meeting in person, and he kept assuring me that he would be in town soon. I was over the moon at the thought of finally meeting the man behind the screen who had captured my attention. One day, out of the blue, he sent me a message saying he had to leave the States unexpectedly for a few weeks due to a family emergency. He told me he had to go back to Kenya to help with some issues there. I was taken aback at first. It didn't quite match up with the life he had described, but I brushed it off as a rare circumstance that anyone might face. He reassured me that his life in the States was still intact and that he would return soon. I accepted his explanation, thinking that sometimes life throws unexpected curveballs. Over the next few weeks, our conversations continued online, though the frequency diminished a bit. He explained that handling family matters abroad kept him busy and that he still cared about our connection. I tried to be supportive, sending messages of encouragement and understanding. However, as time passed, I began to notice subtle inconsistencies. His descriptions of his whereabouts, the places he visited, and even the way he talked about his work started to feel off. At times, his stories sounded rehearsed, almost as if he was reading from a script. I didn't think too much of it at first, assuming that he was simply overwhelmed by the situation. Then came the moment when things took a disturbing turn. I started receiving requests for money. It began with a vague explanation that he had run into some unexpected financial difficulties due to the situation in Kenya. He mentioned that the emergency had drained his funds and that he needed a small loan to cover expenses until his finances could be sorted out. I felt conflicted because I cared about him and wanted to help, but something inside me urged caution. Despite my reservations, I decided to send him a small amount, trusting that he would eventually pay me back. I rationalized that if someone truly cared about me, they wouldn't ask for money right away, and perhaps this was just a temporary setback. After that initial transfer, things escalated quickly. He sent messages explaining more dire financial straits, each one more dramatic than the last. I started to feel the pressure mounting as the amounts he requested grew larger, and the urgency in his tone increased. There was a creeping realization that something wasn't adding up. I began to search his profile photos and details online, and that's when I stumbled upon a disturbing discovery: a forum thread filled with stories similar to mine. Other victims described a pattern of a scammer from Kenya, posing as a successful man living in the States. It hit me hard that the man I had been talking to was part of a larger scam operation. My heart sank as I pieced everything together. Every flattering compliment, every thoughtful message, and every story about his seemingly glamorous life were just part of a well-orchestrated con. I couldn't believe how easily I had been drawn in by a facade that was nothing more than an elaborate lie. The man I thought I was getting to know was actually a scammer using a fake identity to manipulate me and others. The realization left me feeling violated and foolish, as if I had willingly stepped into a trap that I couldn't escape from. I decided to stop sending him money and to cut off contact, but the fallout wasn't immediate. For days I was tormented by a mix of anger, betrayal, and humiliation. I couldn't wrap my head around how someone could go to such lengths to deceive people. I spent a lot of time reading up on online scams and even reached out to a few others who had similar experiences. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a widespread problem affecting many unsuspecting individuals who, like me, were looking for genuine connections in a digital world that was rife with deception. In the midst of all this, I tried to rationalize what had happened to me. I recalled the early days of our conversation, when his words had seemed so sincere. I wondered if I was naive for believing him, but I also knew that the scam was so artfully designed that it played on the emotions of anyone who was looking for something more than just casual flings. The feeling of being duped was overwhelming, and for a long time, I couldn't shake the image of his smiling face, now tainted by the memory of betrayal. I eventually reached out to the dating app support team, providing them with all the details of my interactions with him. I also shared my experience on various online platforms to warn others about this scammer and to help prevent more people from falling victim to the same trap. While my story might just be a small drop in the ocean of similar experiences, I felt that it was important to speak up. I wanted to share the raw truth of what had happened, without embellishment or a neatly wrapped moral, just an account of a disturbing encounter in the world of online dating. Looking back, I realize how easily anyone can be misled by a well-crafted illusion. The scammer from Kenya had managed to create a persona that was not only believable but also irresistibly charming. I was drawn in by the promise of a better life, a glimpse of the luxurious existence he pretended to lead. The more he fed me his carefully constructed narrative, the more I let my guard down, until I was completely entangled in his web of deceit. That experience left a mark on me that I won't forget. I now approach online connections with a heightened sense of caution, always questioning the authenticity of what I see and hear. Despite the pain and betrayal, I can't help but marvel at how convincing a lie can be when it's crafted with such meticulous detail. There's no grand lesson to be learned here, just a straightforward reminder that in the digital age, not everything is as it seems. I ended up being scammed, and that's the unvarnished truth of it. Story 3. I never thought a simple evening could turn into something so bizarre and disturbing. It all started when I went to pick her up one evening, expecting nothing more than a casual ride. I was already a bit distracted by the long day I'd had at work, so when I saw her dash out of her apartment building, I didn't think much of it at first. Instead of walking toward my car as usual, she ran toward the road, and for a split second, it looked like she might jump in front of my car. In that moment, something in my head screamed that she might be trying to pull off some kind of insurance fraud stunt. I slowed down, not wanting to cause any harm, but I let it pass as a freak accident or some sort of bizarre behavior meant to get attention. Later that night, after we got together for dinner at a local restaurant, things took a turn I could never have predicted. Throughout the meal, I was trying to make sense of her earlier actions, but I didn't bring it up because I didn't want to make things awkward. Everything seemed fine until, after the meal, she began making wild claims. Somehow, she twisted the story to allege that I had assaulted her during dinner. It didn't add up at all because I knew I hadn't laid a finger on her, but she was insistent. My mind raced back to that moment on the road, and I started connecting the dots, the stage stunt, the casual dismissal of what could have been a deliberate act, and now these baseless claims of assault. I spent the next few days trying to wrap my head around it all. I couldn't believe that someone I'd spent a pleasant evening with could suddenly transform into a person so deceitful. I replayed every detail in my head, trying to pinpoint where things went wrong. At first, I thought maybe she had an off night, that her behavior was out of character for her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was a pattern. It wasn't a one-off mistake, it was calculated. That moment when she almost jumped in front of my car now felt like the opening act of a twisted performance. It was as if she had orchestrated the whole thing, from the staged accident to the false assault claim, to manipulate the situation for her benefit. I began digging deeper, trying to figure out what might have driven her to do something so deliberately harmful. I talked to a few mutual acquaintances who mentioned she had a reputation for playing the victim and stirring up trouble whenever she got the chance. It seemed that this wasn't the first time she'd been involved in a situation like this, though I had never heard of her before. The realization that I might have been caught up in a well-rehearsed scam made me feel both angry and helpless. I couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled out of control. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief and frustration. I found myself constantly questioning my own actions and judgment. I replayed that evening over and over in my mind, wondering if there was any way I could have seen the warning signs. Every detail, from her hurried exit from the building to her insistence on playing off her near miss with my car, suddenly took on a new disturbing meaning. I began to see it all as part of a larger plan, a plan designed to paint me as the villain while she played the victim flawlessly. At work, I could feel the tension mounting. I became increasingly aware of whispers and sideways glances from colleagues when they heard bits of the story. It wasn't long before the situation started to spill over into other parts of my life. Friends who knew nothing about what had actually happened began to believe her version of events. Their trust in me wavered as they listened to her carefully crafted narrative of me being aggressive and dangerous. It hurt to see how easily a few lies could ruin a person's reputation. I had always believed that truth would eventually prevail, but now I was caught in a web of deceit that was growing tighter with every passing day. I tried to set things right by reaching out to those who had come to believe her story. I explained over and over in long emotional accounts that I had done nothing wrong. I recounted the details as accurately as I could, hoping that someone would see through her manipulations. But it wasn't as simple as it seemed. The more I talked, the more I realized that her narrative had been spun so well that it was difficult for others to see past her version of events. Every explanation I offered was met with skepticism, and I felt increasingly isolated as I struggled to defend myself against accusations that were baseless and cruel. The turning point for me was when I decided to seek legal advice. It felt surreal to be forced into a situation where I had to defend myself in a court of law against claims that were entirely fabricated. The legal process was slow and infuriating, each day filled with mounting stress and a sense of impending doom. I began to wonder if the person I thought I knew was just a master manipulator, someone who had honed the art of twisting reality to serve her own ends. I had trusted her, even admired her charm and wit, only to discover that beneath the surface lay a dangerous tendency to exploit the kindness and trust of others. I started looking up articles and forum posts about similar incidents, and I found that I wasn't alone. There were others who had been caught in her web, victims of her calculated acts of fraud and defamation. Reading about their experiences was both a relief and a source of further anger. It was clear that she had made a career out of this kind of deception, playing on the vulnerabilities of people who believed in the good in others. The realization was sobering. I had been nothing more than another notch in her long list of victims. As the legal process dragged on, I felt myself becoming increasingly numb. The initial shock and anger gradually gave way to a resigned bitterness. I tried to move forward with my life, but the scars of that night remained. Every time I got into my car, I couldn't shake the memory of her almost jumping in front of it, a moment that now symbolized the start of a nightmare I couldn't escape. Every conversation at work carried a hint of suspicion, a reminder that even a single night's events could redefine how people saw you. In quieter moments, I questioned whether I would ever be able to trust again. The experience had left me with a deep sense of vulnerability that was hard to shake. I found myself overanalyzing every interaction, every gesture, searching for any sign of duplicity. It wasn't just about her or the events of that night anymore. It was about the broader realization that people can be masters of disguise, able to conceal their true intentions behind a veneer of normalcy and charm. I had learned that in a split second, everything I believed could be shattered by one well-executed performance. Despite everything, I eventually had to accept that some wounds don't heal quickly. The whole ordeal ended without a clear victory for either side. The legal claims eventually faded away, the accusations lost in the shuffle of everyday life, but the experience left an indelible mark on me. I still carry the memory of that night in my mind, a stark reminder of how easily reality can be manipulated by someone with the right motives. There was no grand moral to be drawn from it, just the cold, hard fact that I had been caught up in a disturbing charade that I couldn't have foreseen. Now, whenever I reflect on that time, I see it as a dark chapter in my life, one that changed how I view the world and the people in it. I don't dwell on the details too much, because revisiting them only brings back the unease and betrayal I felt. Instead, I try to focus on moving forward, even if the trust I once had is forever altered. It was a straightforward, unsettling experience that left me with more questions than answers, and it serves as a reminder of the unexpected turns life can take in just one night. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. I had been on Tinder for a while, swiping and chatting, not really expecting anything life-changing to come out of it. Then I matched with him, an attractive guy with an easy smile and a profile that radiated confidence. We had a few light conversations that didn't go anywhere too serious at first, but eventually, we agreed to meet up for a date. I was excited, a little nervous, and hopeful that maybe this could be the start of something interesting. I never imagined how disturbing things would get, or how his absence would lead to a story I'd end up recounting with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. The day of our date started out normally enough. I dressed up in my favorite jeans and a simple top, and I even did my hair a little differently than usual because I wanted to feel good about myself. I was already picturing how the night would unfold. A nice dinner, good conversation, maybe a few laughs, and who knows what else. I arrived at the designated cafe early, hoping to get a sense of the place and maybe catch a glimpse of him if he was early. Time passed slowly as I sipped my coffee and watched the people going in and out of the shop. I kept checking my phone for any text from him, but nothing came. I waited, thinking maybe he was just caught in traffic or running a bit late. Little did I know that something far more dramatic was happening that would completely derail his plans to meet me. After about an hour of waiting, my initial excitement turned into a creeping sense of unease. I started to wonder if he had changed his mind. I tried to tell myself that maybe it was just a miscommunication, or that something had come up that was out of his control. I was just about to leave when my phone buzzed with a notification from News app. My heart sank as I read the headline about a drunk driver who had caused a fatal accident. I remember feeling a jolt of anxiety as I read the details and realized that the accident had happened on the same stretch of road where he lived. I couldn't help but think that it might be connected to him. I spent the next few days in a sort of daze, trying to process what had happened. I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that something was off about our conversations on Tinder. Looking back, there were subtle hints in his messages that now seemed far more sinister. He talked about having a rough time, hinted at some personal demons, and there was always a vague reference to his reckless behavior. At the time, I had chalked it up to typical bad boy bravado, but now I wondered if I had missed something more serious. The news reports later revealed that he had been arrested for drunk driving after a high-speed chase, and in the process, he had been involved in a collision that resulted in the death of someone. The details were all over the local news, and his face was plastered all over every screen. It was surreal to think that I had been planning a date with someone who ended up causing such a tragedy. In the days that followed, I found myself obsessively reading every article and watching every news clip I could find about the incident. I wanted to understand how someone could be so careless with their life and the lives of others. I read that the accident happened late at night, just a couple of hours after our planned meeting time, and that he had been out celebrating with some friends before getting behind the wheel. It was hard to comprehend how a night that started with the promise of a fun date could end with such a devastating outcome. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and regret. Relief because I had somehow dodged a bullet by not having met him in person, and regret because it felt like I had been unwittingly involved in something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. The whole experience changed the way I viewed online dating. I started to pay closer attention to red flags and messages, to look beyond the polished images and the smooth words. I began to wonder how many others might have ended up in dangerous situations because they overlooked the subtle signals that something wasn't quite right. I started questioning my own judgment, wondering how I could have missed the signs. I spent countless hours scouring online forums and social media groups where people shared similar stories of near misses and unsettling encounters on dating apps. It was comforting in a strange way, knowing that I wasn't alone in this, even though the shared stories often made my skin crawl. I remember one particular evening, not long after the incident, when I found myself scrolling through my Tinder matches and feeling a deep sense of caution. Every profile seemed to hide a potential danger behind its bright smile and flattering filters. I couldn't help but think of him every time I saw a picture that reminded me of the carefree, reckless energy he once exuded in his photos. I realized that the whole experience was a stark reminder of how unpredictable people can be. One moment, you're chatting with someone who seems perfectly charming, and the next, you find out that they've been involved in something so terrible that it shakes you to your core. Even though I eventually deleted the app for a while, the memory of that night stayed with me. I tried to tell myself that it was just a freak accident, but I was lucky not to have been involved in any way. But every time I saw a news report about another case of drunk driving or heard about another fatal accident on the roads, I couldn't help but think about that night. It was as if the incident had become a part of me, a constant reminder of the thin line between normal life and sudden, unforeseen tragedy. I became more vigilant, more aware of the hidden dangers lurking in seemingly ordinary situations. Looking back now, I can't help but feel that the whole ordeal was a harsh wake-up call. It wasn't just about one bad date or one reckless decision. It was a glimpse into the fragility of life and the dark undercurrents that often go unnoticed until it's too late. I learned that sometimes the people who seem to be the most charming can hide the darkest secrets. I learned that online platforms, while convenient, can also be breeding grounds for stories that are far more disturbing than anything you could imagine. And above all, I learned that sometimes life takes a sudden turn into territory that is both terrifying and irreversible. I've moved on from that chapter of my life, but I still carry the memory of that night with me. It serves as a reminder to always trust my instincts and to never ignore the small warnings that life gives us. I don't dwell on it too much, though, because I've learned that sometimes it's best to just let things be and move forward. The experience was disturbing, and it left me with more questions than answers, but it also made me stronger in a way that I never expected. I've become more cautious, more aware of the world around me, and more grateful for the times when things go right. That night taught me that sometimes the most unassuming moments can have the most profound impacts on our lives, and that we should never take anything for granted. The story ends not with a neat conclusion or a moral, but simply as a chapter in my life that I can look back on with a mixture of disbelief and understanding. There's no grand lesson here, just the stark reality of how one person's recklessness can ripple out and affect the lives of others in ways you never thought possible. It's a reminder that in the world of online dating and beyond, you can never fully know the person on the other side of the screen. I've learned to be more cautious and to always listen to that little voice inside me that sometimes whispers, something isn't right. And while I may never completely shake off the memory of that disturbing night, I've learned to live with it, using it as a quiet reminder of life's unpredictable and often unsettling nature. I never thought I'd be caught up in something so crazy that it would nearly tear my marriage apart. It all started on one of those slow evenings when I was browsing Tinder out of boredom. I wasn't really looking for anything serious, just a bit of distraction, so I didn't really care much about the profiles or where things might lead. That was until I matched with someone who seemed perfect, a person with an exciting life, captivating photos, and a quirky sense of humor that drew me in immediately. I thought I was just having harmless fun, but it soon turned into something much more twisted and complicated. At first, our conversations were fun and engaging. I spent hours messaging back and forth, feeling like I discovered a kindred spirit who could relate to me on levels I rarely experienced with anyone else. I was enjoying the thrill of it, thinking it was just a little escape from the routine of everyday life. I made sure to keep it separate from my home life. After all, I was married and had a family. I told myself that what I was doing was nothing more than chatting with someone I'd never meet, just to break the monotony. It didn't feel like it was crossing any lines at the time. As days turned into weeks, I got more invested in this mysterious connection. I started to open up about parts of my life that I usually kept hidden, things that I felt no one else understood. The person on the other end seemed to be genuinely interested, and it felt exhilarating to be seen in that way. I was careful to keep my real identity hidden, using a profile that was just a little too polished, a little too perfect. I figured that no one needed to know that behind every carefully curated image and well-rehearsed message was someone who was just trying to escape reality for a while. The deeper I got into it, the more I started to live in two different worlds. At home, I was the devoted husband, the one who took care of everything, always present and supportive. Online, I was this adventurous, mysterious person who could talk about anything without fear of judgment. I justified it as harmless fun, a temporary diversion. But the more I hid this part of my life, the heavier the burden grew. I was constantly worried about being discovered, and that anxiety started creeping into every interaction I had. One day, things took an unexpected turn. A friend of my wife, who she had known for years, reached out to her with some surprising information. Apparently, my wife's friend had been on Tinder too and came across the profile that I had created. This friend, thinking it was interesting and maybe a bit funny, mentioned it casually to my wife during a conversation about dating apps. I had no idea that the profile I'd set up, this carefully constructed persona, was already known to someone who was close to my wife. It hit me like a ton of bricks when I later saw the look of shock and hurt in her eyes, even though she didn't say much at the moment. I realized that my secret had been exposed, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. When my wife confronted me about it, I felt like I was drowning in my own lies. The realization that the person I had pretended to be was now out in the open, and that her trust was hanging by a thread, was more than I could bear. I tried to explain that it was all just online banter, nothing more than harmless chatting with a stranger, but my words felt empty. I could see the disappointment and betrayal in her eyes, and it was like watching a part of my life shatter before me. In that moment, I knew I had put everything at risk, and the thought of losing her over something that started as a silly escape made my heart sink. The next few days were a blur of tension and regret. I spent hours thinking about every conversation, every moment I had spent immersed in that online persona. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what had seemed like an innocent distraction had grown into a deceptive double life that I couldn't easily step back from. I tried to salvage things by promising myself that I would end it immediately and come clean, but the guilt and the fear of facing the consequences made it hard to break free from the web of lies I'd spun. The fallout wasn't immediate, but the tension in our household was palpable. My wife became distant, and every time I tried to explain or apologize, it only seemed to drive us further apart. I felt isolated in my guilt, trapped between the person I pretended to be online and the husband I was supposed to be at home. I found myself avoiding conversations and hiding behind excuses, all while the truth loomed large between us. Every time I saw her hurt expression, it was a stark reminder of how my actions had put everything I valued in jeopardy. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was also the realization that I had willingly chosen to create a facade and maintain this secret. I had always believed that a little harmless fun online wouldn't hurt anyone, but now I was faced with the reality that my actions had real consequences. I began to wonder how I had let things spiral so far out of control, and whether the person I thought I was online had any resemblance to the person I truly wanted to be. The internal conflict was exhausting, and I spent many sleepless nights wondering if I could ever truly make amends. I eventually made the difficult decision to come clean, to tell my wife everything in hopes that honesty might be the first step towards healing the rift I'd created. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, bearing all my insecurities and admitting that I had been chasing an illusion. I was met with anger and hurt, emotions that I knew were justified. There were long, painful days where we barely spoke, and every conversation felt like a reminder of my betrayal. I didn't try to sugarcoat anything or offer neat explanations. There was no way to justify what I had done. I simply accepted the consequences and did my best to be patient while we both processed the situation. Over time, things began to settle, though not without scars. The process of rebuilding trust was slow and fraught with setbacks. I had to confront parts of myself that I'd long ignored, the underlying reasons why I had sought solace in an online persona instead of facing my real life. It forced me to evaluate the choices I made and the values I had compromised. Even though the damage had been done, there were moments when we both started to reconnect over shared memories and a mutual desire to move forward. However, the ghost of that online deception lingered in the background, a constant reminder of the fragility of trust and the ease with which a single mistake could lead to chaos. Now looking back at everything that happened, I can't help but feel a mixture of regret and relief. Regret for having created a situation that nearly cost me the love of my life, and relief that we managed to survive that turbulent period. I never meant to hurt anyone, and the lessons I learned were painful but necessary. The experience was a harsh wake-up call about how small, seemingly harmless decisions can have enormous repercussions. Even though I still live with the guilt of that betrayal, it has made me more aware of the importance of honesty and the value of the relationships that truly matter. I'm not saying that everything is perfect now or that the wounds have completely healed. There are still moments when the memory of that deception cuts deep, and I have to remind myself of the price I almost paid for a fleeting escape from reality. The truth is, there's no magic fix for a mistake like this, only the slow, sometimes painful process of rebuilding trust. The story of my catfishing on Tinder isn't one of redemption or a neat moral. It's just a messy, real-life mess that I had to work through, one difficult day at a time. I live with the consequences, aware that some scars never fully fade, and that's just part of life. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen.